Hello, my name is Aiden, and I will be presenting on Adlai Stevenson. So, a little background on Adlai. He was an American ambassador born in 1900. People describe him as having this low-key style and sense of humor, and generally was known as sort of a non-confrontational person, which is important in his story in the UN. Moreover, he was the governor of Illinois in 1948. He had a part in helping found the UN. He ran for president unsuccessfully twice in 1952 and 1956. And then when JFK was elected in 1960, um, JFK, elected Stevenson to be the chief U.S. delegate for the UN. And mainly his role within the UN is generally known as his work regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, regarding Stevens's early work in the UN, when he first joined and first became the chief delegate, the U.S. was involved in training Cuban exiles to fight Cubans. Basically, they were training these exiles in flying planes and basically fighting. Eventually, the exiles struck Cuba and attacked a military base. I think it was an Air Force base, and then returned to the U.S. And this resulted in a lot of conflict between Cuba and America, or the U.S. because, well, Cuba was accusing the U.S. of training these exiles and basically attacking Cuba, to which the U.S. denied and said that they were actually Cuban Air Force pilots and not technically Americans or technically fighters fighting for the U.S. And basically, Stevenson was forced to represent the U.S. in a lie, telling Cuba that these bombers were in fact from the Cuban Air Force. Eventually, the truth came out. JFK admitted to it. Stevenson basically was upset that the U.S. would put him in that position. He's quoted saying he was absolutely sunk at having misled the United Nations. And really his disappointment with the U.S. and his shame in misleading the UN, I think, sort of demonstrates his strong moral compass, which kind of guided him throughout his tenure, and we'll see more of later. So now, really, what Stevenson was known for was his role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I talked a little bit about its starting, but now we're going to get into the meat of it. So the U.S. received intel that the Soviets were harboring missiles in Cuba, and then JFK accused the Soviets of this. This caused conflict, obviously, and JFK really thought that the Security Council, was the place to raise the issue, which meant that Stevenson would be sort of at the center of the debate and the face of the debate for the U.S. And really early on, JFK and a lot of other people lacked confidence in Stevenson because they thought he would be too weak and, like I said before, too non-confrontational, which would give the U.S. a weak position in this debate. And this sort of fear in Stevenson was heightened because when initially Stevenson sort of opted for compromise rather than military confrontation in the early stages of this conflict. And Stevenson was given signed aids to help him in creating speeches and just showing the surveillance evidence. And Stevenson had a lot of suspicion for these people, and I think that came down to the fact that he didn't want to be the face of another U.S. lie or be the face of another U.S. PR failure, if you will. And then basically Stevenson gave his the U.S.'s initial complaint to the council, and he didn't show any of the surveillance evidence that the U.S. had at this point. And then Stevenson was practicing for his big speech, in which he would show the evidence and accuse Soviets of harboring missiles. And this speech was long and aggressive. It was 65 pages long, and it really was going to be sort of digging into the Soviets. And JFK had a lot of, he was unsure of how to proceed because he thought that maybe that having a speech that was this aggressive at the Soviets and that was attacking the Soviets this much would sort of reduce the chances that the Soviets would want to just fall back and leave. So on the right before Stevenson was about to give his speech, JFK called and said, to dial it back. And so then that meeting was postponed while the speech was amended to be less aggressive and less confrontational. Then Stevenson was going to give this less confrontational speech when JFK called again and said, "Just kidding, dig in, be aggressive, be as aggressive as you want, use the original version of the speech." And so Stevenson gave this speech. He really sort of accused the Soviets of harboring these missiles and really was sort of direct in questioning Zorin, Zorin being the Soviet ambassador at the time. And there's a quote here. Stephen says, "Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles in sites in Cuba? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no." Zorin says, "I'm not an American. I'm in an American courtroom, sir, and I do not wish to answer a question put to me in a manner of a prosecuting counsel. You will receive the answer in due course." And then Stephen says, "You are in the courtroom of world opinion right now, and you can answer yes or no. You've denied that they exist, and I want to know whether I've understood you correctly. I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that is your decision. I'm also prepared to present the evidence in this room." So you can see from that Stevenson, who was thought to be this non-confrontational, sort of weak character, is really pushing the issue onto Zorin and really being direct and questioning him. And this confrontation surprised everyone. It was really successful. After that quote that I just read, Zorin was sort of trying to recover the initiative, and Stevenson sort of leaped to the advantage and kept seizing the opportunity to come out on top of this debate, which, again, it surprised everyone. And then from that, he proceeded to deliver this evidence, the surveillance evidence. And a little anecdote, his aides mixed up the order of the photos that he had been planning to present them in, which, you'd expect a guy who's seen as sort of a low-key, quiet guy, that might be a problem, but he fully improvised and really gave a successful presentation of this evidence. And overall, I know I've said this a lot, but just to reiterate, Stevenson was much more successful in, accusing the Soviets and being direct and confrontational than he was expected to be. So to move on to the efficacy or how well his speech and his performance worked, there's a lot of debate over it. You would think that, such a powerful presentation and a convincing argument would have really convinced people that the Soviets were harboring missiles. And people said that it did, but behind closed doors, many non-affiliated and some Western states admit that they weren't actually convinced by Stevenson that Soviets had any missiles. So it's sort of up in the air. Yep, that's all I have. These are my sources. Thanks for listening. Yep.